Aiden, you see my PowerPoint for the devotional? Billy. Billy. Good evening. And the church said, hey, there we go. Good evening. Good to see everybody. I invite you to join me in Psalm 48. Psalm 48. So good to have everybody with us. I know that we do have a couple of visitors, maybe more than that, but I've seen two so far. And we're glad that you're here. We hope you'll come back every time that you have the opportunity to do so. We'd love to have you be a part of any of our services here. Psalm 48 is, like all of them, a beautiful psalm. As a matter of fact, that word beautiful might well be one of the things that your eyes are drawn to and our hearts as we read this. I want you to think, when we get much further down the line, like around 130, Psalm 137 or so, when the people are in captivity, they are so longing to get back to Jerusalem or to Zion. As a matter of fact, they said, the people over here keep saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And the expression is, I can't do that. If I'm able to do that, may the tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. May my right hand forget its cunning. In other words, the playing upon the instrument. And if I forget thee or somewhat sing the songs of Zion in this strange land. And so Jerusalem in Mount Zion was a very, very important place, obviously, to the Jewish people. From the time that God said, that's where I will dwell among the people. That's where I'll put my name, okay? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Most all you hear from a certain part in time of the Old Testament forward is the very heart of Jewish life really was around the city of what? Jerusalem, okay? Jerusalem, okay? This is not a history lesson on the city. We can do that at some other time, okay? But it's so very important to understand this as we study this psalm. And the importance of the holy city, as it's referred to, is not just the fact that it was a place where God's people dwelt, but it was the place where who was understood to dwell. It was all because of God. There at the temple and the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, all of those things. This is the very heart of what makes Jerusalem so great. And this psalm is written to draw that aspect out. But you'll notice, as many great things are said about Mount Zion and Jerusalem, which found its home there, none of that is expressed without the extolling and exalting of the God that made Jerusalem what it was. Okay? That's a couple of things I want us to see in this particular psalm. Okay? You can probably break this down, the first 3 verses, and then probably verse 4 through about verse 8, and then 9 through 14. Might be some natural divisions. Others may break it up in a little different fashion. Okay? And so Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Who used those words back to back one time and say, oh, how I would have gathered you together, called you together as a mother hen would her chicks, but you wouldn't come. Jesus did. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. So This is the Jerusalem of the Old Testament, and in the minds and eyes of the people then. Another one of those, a psalm of the sons of Korah. Some of your Bibles may say a song and a what? Psalm, okay? Spurgeon says in his commentary, not every song was a psalm, and then not every psalm was a what? A song, necessarily, or written that way. But this is one that kind of features qualities of both. Great is the Lord, verse 1, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in his holy mountain. Now, everything that's said right here in this first verse is really what's highlighted in the rest of the psalm. The greatness of the Lord and how praiseworthy he is, and then what? The city of that God, as they call our God, and here it is in his holy mount. You might say that one of the things for which God is being praised, at least in this particular psalm, is for his holy mount, Mount Zion, and for this holy city, Jerusalem. When we think about the greatness of the Lord, as this is how this psalm begins and how he is greatly to be praised, if you're having trouble focusing your attention on why we should worship when you come together, as we come together on the Lord's Day or at any other time, this may be one of those verses, or at least this first sentence of it, to help draw our minds to why we're here. Does that make sense? Always ask yourselves the question, if you're struggling, you ever get in a rut in worship or sometimes feel, man, I've had a rough week, sometimes sin has entered our lives and we're having trouble bolstering that passion to really worship. Sometimes we can come and sit in the pew, but are we really worshiping? You know, I was there, but was I really there in spirit? Did I really pour out my heart in worship and adoration to the Lord? We'll go back to this psalm and think of how great the Lord is. A lot of times bringing our minds away from everything else and simply focusing on the greatness of God is sometimes what we need to be centered and to rekindle our passion for worship. Do you agree or disagree with that? Okay? And sometimes we're filled with so many things of the world, even if it's just the distractions of the world. All you have to do in your life, and you may find that, well, I'm just blowing in and blowing out of worship. I felt like I was hardly there. Did I really pour out my heart of praise to worship God today? If I'm having those struggles, finding that passion for worship, it's because I'm distracted and something else really has me more than God does. And when we stop and focus on the greatness of God, I think very quickly he gets us back. Okay? Our minds cannot help but think of all the great things about God, and he is greatly to be praised. And then, of course, for the Jews at that time, in the city of our God and in his holy mountain. Let's look at verse 2. Beautiful in, all right, give me your different translations here. Elevation is what a lot of them say. Height. What else? Situation. That's the one I was looking for. And none of those disagree. The situation of Jerusalem was of considerable height. Okay? The situation of Jerusalem was also in elevation. Why? Go back again to the last word in the first verse. It is upon a what? Mount. Mount Zion. Okay? Now, there are a lot of people who would point to the fact that if you were be able to stand on certain places of Jerusalem, even of the temple, that the views would be unbelievable. I don't believe that's really what he has in mind here, though it may have had some great physical beauty. I think what's being described here, how did people of those days really consider being close to the God that they worshiped? whether you were talking about paganism, whether you were talking about the Samaritans who thought Mount Gerizim, John 4, was the place where we ought to worship God. Remember the woman at the well? And she said, but you say Jerusalem, in essence, Mount Zion is the place where we ought to worship. So why did Elijah call the 450 prophets of Baal to where? Mount Carmel. Okay. The mindset of the people back then was the higher you could get up in elevation, the closer you were to who? To your God, whoever that might have been. I'm considering Gentile cultures too, just the state mindset of man back then, but Jews felt that way too. And if you were that close, then surely the smoke of your altars and the sound of your voices and your singing would be able to what? To be heard, to reach. Okay, that was the idea there. I'm going to tell you this. As long as the people of God in Jerusalem and today are faithful to God and worship Him in spirit and in truth, it would not matter if you were in the deepest, darkest abyss. Guess who's going to hear you there? And I think that's brought out in a few of the Psalm 139 may be one of those. Okay, you're not going to get away from God's presence, but he heard Jonah in the belly of the great fish, right? And I do not know to what depths that great fish swam after he swallowed him up, but nonetheless, he heard him down there, right? And so, but the idea here is the elevation, the situation, the height. Look, because of that, it is described, second line of verse 2, the joy of the whole what? Earth. I think this is going to be brought about a little bit later, but it is though Jerusalem here is being described as kind of the crowning jewel of all of God's doing of the earth. There were beautiful places of the earth. There were great and mighty kingdoms all over the land. None, though, as shining as a star like his city on his hill, where was Jerusalem and the temple. No other place on earth, no matter how you dressed it up, was going to compare. Okay? Then it goes on to say, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. Is he talking about Solomon, the great king? Oh, the first king, Saul. Is that who he's talking about? Who's he talking about? The King of kings and Lord of lords. This is the king. There may be other great and powerful kingdoms that are made by men, but what's going to happen to every one of those kingdoms? They'll fall. And even if any of them are lasting at his final coming, even that one's not going into where? Eternity. Okay? And so this may be a little prophetic as well about the coming of the kingdom of Christ, because of that kingdom that we read this morning out of Daniel, given to that son of that dominion, his dominion, there'll be no end. It'll be everlasting. Okay? All right, so God is in her palaces. That's why she's so great. He is known as her what? Refuge. Now, 2 weeks ago, you go back to chapter 46, Psalm 46. Verse 1, okay? The Lord is my refuge and strength, a very present help where? In trouble. Okay? And then later on about the refuge there in that same psalm. Well, here it's brought up again. What was a refuge, just real quick, for the people of Israel, for these Jews? What was a refuge? What did that term mean to them? It was safe harbor, wasn't it? Safety. That's important because look at verse number 4. For behold, the kings assembled. Now this is talking about the kings of other nations, Gentile kings. The kings assembled. They passed by together. That is, they passed by Jerusalem. They passed by Mount Zion. Now, reckon why they were passing by. What does the expression here mean, maybe? What they want to do? They wanted to attack Jerusalem. They passed by together. They even assembled in bands to do this. Verse 5, they saw it, and so they what? They marveled. In other words, it was the plan to come take this place? Whoo, I don't know. The very next line in verse 5, they were troubled, and they did what? Hastened away. Now, they didn't just go away. They didn't just kind of ease on out. What's the word there again? Hasten. And it means to what? They hurried. Now, well, that shows you the inspiring awe of what they traveled upon, right? No matter how many kingdoms had come together with all of their armies and all their fighting men and all their war horses and all their chariots, when they came to the place that was the city of God, they all had but one response, and that was what? They marveled, and then they were afraid, and then they, with great haste, in a hurry, kind of like a deacon kicking up dust that was stirring. Boy, it was dust flying off their heels when they got away from there. Okay? Jasper? They took flight. They were in panic, and that's the meaning here. They were so upset with fear. They were trembling. Some translations say they trembled. And then what? They took off. One commentator said they came in one way and they left by about 20 others. Just whichever way was quickest, whichever one was in their flight, not necessarily in their flight pan, just in their path, let's get out of here, okay? And so that's how awe-inspiring this place was. And again, maybe it was due to the fact, look, these other kings and kingdoms, armies, they had gone up against very strong nations and other capital cities as well. But I think there was the idea among the Jews, you tell me what it was. Trying to fight uphill toward that city was one thing. It was not undoable. It was later done. Matter of fact, more than one time. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians would later do it. And past the time of Jesus, in about AD 70, Rome would later do it. So it was not insurmountable. But through its structure, through it being on Mount Zion, and boy, here's the magnificence of this place. What did many of the Gentile people know? What? Okay, and come again? Y'all said the same thing. They had heard and knew of the power of God that was in that place. And so many times out on the battlefield, you'd have captains go back and tell a king their God is doing what? Fighting for them. Their God is with them. And so immediately when they heard those words, what did they know? Could you get to Jerusalem if God was angry with his people and kind of withdrew his presence, if he so desired? Yes. You could get to them then. But if the Lord was with them, that a lot of times the Jewish people never even had to fight because the Lord was with them. He turned the battle in disarray, if you will. All right, so we come down to verse number 6.